Welcome to our discussion of the case United States versus Curtiss-Wright Export Company. This was a case arising during the New Deal era and involving Congress and the President of the United States, President Franklin Roosevelt. The case was decided in 1936 during a time of upheaval worldwide. And the case, though, involves the assertion of the United States authority over our hemisphere. So basically what happened in terms of the facts are that a company in the United States was exporting munitions and airplanes and guns and ammunition to the Chaco region in South America. And it was actually selling these munitions to both sides in that conflict. So it was arming both sides and profiting off of their killing each other. Congress was very concerned that conflict might break out into an even greater conflict in South America, and it didn't want to have to deal with that. It wanted to invest our attention in solving problems occurring in Europe with fascism, and also in Asia and Japan and China with the rise of authoritarian regimes. So Congress authorized the President of the United States to restrict, actually even prohibit the export of certain goods out of the United States. And these goods were goods that were produced by the Curtiss-Wright Export Company. The case involves a question of inherent powers. Now, there are enumerated powers in the Constitution. They're listed, and there are implied powers in the Constitution. We know from McCulloch v. Maryland that the Necessary and Proper Clause provides Congress with some implied powers. But how about inherent powers? In other words, powers that may or may not be specified, but that exist outside of the constitutional framework. They would exist even without a constitution. And this is a statement from Justice Story. From the whole mass of the powers of the national government and from the nature of political society, not as a consequence of incident of power specifically enumerated, inherent powers exist. So these inherent powers come from the character of having a government, not as a consequence of specifying powers, but just simply something that adheres to the very idea of a government existing. So the Curtiss-Wright Export Company involves these, whether inherent powers exist in the presidency. And the question was, may Congress issue this resolution to the president that concerns external affairs and that gives the president the power to control U.S. involvement in foreign affairs? It gives him the power to control our involvement in foreign affairs by regulating the domestic economy in this case. In other words, telling Curtiss-Wright Export Company, you may have manufactured these munitions in the United States, but you will not export them to the Chaco region to arm rebels and the government. So who is in charge of the domestic economy? Well, usually it's Congress, and the president can't act without Congress's authority. In this case, Congress gave the president authority to do what he saw necessary to regulate external affairs, to exercise his inherent powers as the sole organ of the United States foreign policy, sole representative of the United States outside our borders. Can Congress do that? And the vote in this case was yes, 7-1, and Sutherland, Justice Sutherland, writes the majority opinion. Now, he makes this argument. He says that history demonstrates that the federal government has always had authority over external affairs, and the states have no power in this area. Now, one of the arguments that Curtiss-Wright made was that if anybody was supposed to to regulate the export or the manufacture of these goods and their export. It would be Congress, but in the absence of Congress regulating it, it would be the states. But here is what Justice Sutherland had to say about history demonstrating that the federal government has authority over external affairs. This is in the middle of his opinion. He says, "The Union existed before the Constitution, which was ordained and established, among other things, to form, quote, a more perfect union." In other words, the Union existed beforehand, and the Constitution perfects it. "Prior to that event, it is clear that the Union, declared by the Articles of Confederation to be perpetual, was the sole possessor of external sovereignty, and in the Union it remained without change save insofar as the Constitution in express terms qualified its exercise." Then dropping down to the next paragraph, "It results that the investment of the federal government with the powers of external sovereignty did not depend upon the affirmative grants of the Constitution. The powers to declare and wage war, to conclude peace, to make treaties, to maintain diplomatic relations with other sovereignties, if they had never been mentioned in the Constitution, would have vested in the federal government as necessary concomitants of nationality." So there are powers that are implied in the Constitution just by virtue of the existence of government, and those implied powers don't depend on the Constitution for their existence. For example, we have several examples here. Several constitutional amendments say Congress shall have the authority to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So Congress is giving to itself an implied power, right, to enforce an amendment through, not through specific legislation, but through appropriate legislation. In another case, South Carolina v. Katzenbach, the court said that Congress can use any rational means to effectuate the constitutional prohibition of racial discrimination in voting against the reserved powers of the state. So all that Congress must do is act rationally with respect to carrying something into effect. But how about when it comes to the delegation of Congress's powers to another branch or a representative of a branch? That's what's happening in this case. Congress is taking some of its powers over the domestic economy and giving them to the President of the United States and saying, you do what is necessary within specific limits and bounds. So Congress gave instructions like the President could put in an embargo on the export of munitions in place, but that it had to expire within a certain period of time, and that the President couldn't leave it in place when hostilities no longer existed in the region, etc., etc. Can Congress do something like that? Well, the general rule is not one of non-delegation. So what we're talking about here is the non-delegation doctrine. A power once delegated cannot be redelegated. So if the Constitution delegates a power to Congress, Congress, generally speaking, is not supposed to be able to take that power and hand it off to some other body. For example, Congress couldn't take its powers to legislate and give that to the President. But that's precisely what it did here. It said the President has the power to put an embargo into place, to determine what the penalties were, and to lift the embargo when he wanted. And that's legislation. The history of the non-delegation doctrine is that it's not often followed. And why is that? Congress is really busy. It doesn't have time to micromanage situations that change sometimes by the hour, at least by the day. And Congress needs to invest its energy in other places. Also, the President is much more capable of handling foreign policy situations that change daily. Also, we need flexibility, and that flexibility sometimes has to be invested in the executive, not Congress. It's not a very flexible institution. Politically, it's expedient. It's expedient for Congress to delegate its authority to an unelected bureaucrat, because then that bureaucrat takes all the heat for what he's done, and Congress can hold investigatory hearings, and congressmen won't feel the effects at the polls. So the court holds in this case that, and other cases also, that delegations can occur. Congress can delegate its power, but there must be limits. What are those limits? Well, in a case called Wayman versus Southern, the court said that it can make its own rules. It can make its own rules, and Congress can delegate its power over the court's appellate jurisdiction to the courts and allow the courts to make their own rules. In Hampton versus United States, the court said that Congress can give powers to the president so long as it provides intelligible principles by which he may act, and that there is a rationale for giving the president those powers. That's an important case because it's affirmed here. And so the New Deal was largely predicated on delegating powers to the president. Congress delegated quite a bit of its powers to the president over the domestic economy. And here's what the court had to say. In a case called Panama Refining Company versus Ryan, the court strikes down the delegation of rulemaking authority to the president to set quotas on oil production because Congress gave no instructions to him whatsoever. It just said, you be the legislature. You set the quotas on oil production. Oh, and it didn't even give an end date to when the president would stop exercising the power. In another case we'll get to much later, Schechter Poultry versus United States, the court strikes down the delegation of legislative power to the president because the delegation involved regulation of the entire poultry industry, not just simply those areas that Congress would traditionally regulate, but also areas that would be regulated by the states. And we'll get into that in more detail. Justice Cardozo referred to the New Deal delegation of power by Congress to the president as delegation running riot. In other words, Congress giving the president, the executive, tremendous power to regulate the domestic economy in a way that the Constitution never intended. To conclude this lecture, I just want to read to you from the end of Justice Sutherland's opinion. This is the important part. It's the last paragraph in the excerpt in your text. He says, "We deem it unnecessary to consider the several clauses which are said to evidence the unconstitutionality of the joint resolution as involving an unlawful delegation of legislative power." We're not even going to look at them, he says. There's no sense. We've upheld it as constitutional. "It is enough to summarize by saying that both upon principle and in accordance with precedent, we conclude there is sufficient warrant for the broad discretion vested in the President to determine whether the enforcement of the statute will have a beneficial effect upon the reestablishment of peace in the affected countries," and then dropping down a little bit, "and to prescribe limitations and exceptions to which the enforcement of the resolution shall be subject." So in the end, U.S. versus Curtiss-Wright comes to the conclusion that because the president is vested with all of the authority over foreign relations, Congress can take that into account and give some of its power over the domestic economy to the president, where that domestic economy influences foreign policy. For example, producing domestic munitions, arms, ammunition, and other machines of war. Congress can reasonably give the president some of its power as long as it provides general principles and guidelines for him to act by. Well, that is United States versus Curtiss-Wright. Thank you very much for your attention.